know that I know people in their own organization that like nobody likes their team this year. They say that they are like the unfriendliest group. So we're not the only ones who feel that way. Internal people.
Listen, what just happened inside that podcast studio is the kind of moment that doesn't come around very often in professional sports. Sophie Cunningham, a former Phoenix Mercury player who knows this organization from the inside out, just dropped something absolutely massive that's going to reverberate through the entire WNBA for weeks to come. And here's the thing, this isn't just some random former player throwing out hot takes for attention. This is someone with real, tangible credibility, speaking directly from sources she trusts. She came right out and said it. People working in...
If he's in Arizona, I may be wrong, but I think he is. He works for Outkick. The Arizona Diamondbacks invited Alyssa Thomas, who punched Caitlin Clark in the throat, to throw out the first pitch tonight. She's being treated like a hero. Now, look, I did a little research. I think last night was Phoenix Mercury night, all right, at the Arizona Diamondbacks.
Inside the Phoenix Mercury organization itself, actual employees whose paychecks depend on that team's success are telling her that nobody likes this team right now. Not the fans, not the media. Not even the people who work there every single day. That's not casual complaints you hear around the water cooler. That's a complete organizational breakdown happening in real time. What makes this revelation so incredibly significant is the specific...
Caitlin Clark did not practice. Neither did Sophie Cunningham. This is interesting. No practice today for Sophie Cunningham, illness. Caitlin Clark back. Fever with their first of 4 days of practice during the Commissioner's Cup break. Demarius Dantes also getting some individual treatment. So that's pretty wild. I would assume if they'd have had a game today, Caitlin Clark wouldn't have played. I don't guess so.
Specific way Sophie delivered it. There was zero hesitation in her voice. No stumbling over words. No backpedaling or softening the blow. She said it with the kind of absolute certainty that only comes from someone who has been sitting on this information, carefully vetting it, making sure her sources are solid before she ever decided to go public with it.
Brennan right here. Megan L. Hall, women's sports. Of course, she's got an Asia Wilson quote. Guys, you don't hate the media enough. So she decides to slam Sophie Cunningham over making these comments. Number one, this is wildly unprofessional. Why? To go out there and she's reporting something at this point. Sophie is...
You don't speak with that kind of confidence about something this explosive unless you know exactly what you're talking about. And let's be crystal clear about something else here. Sophie Cunningham isn't some random influencer making wild accusations from her bedroom. She actually played meaningful minutes for the Phoenix Mercury. She knows these people on a deeply personal level. She spent time...
Moment into I'm reporting something. I've got a source or sources, and look, Sophie Cunningham played in that organization, by the way. She played in that organization. I think she's done courtside. She's done courtside for the Suns. So she knows. There's no confusion here.
Time in that locker room. She's dealt with that front office. She's experienced their organizational culture firsthand during her own playing career. On top of all that, she's currently doing courtside broadcasting work for the Phoenix Suns, which means she's still actively embedded in that Arizona sports ecosystem right now, still connected to people who work inside these organizations. So when she gets on her podcast and calmly reports that reliable people inside the Mercury organization have directly told her that practically nobody actually likes this team, you have to understand that she's not just throwing spaghetti at the wall hoping something sticks. She's citing real sources. She's providing verifiable inside information that the general public would never have access to through normal mainstream channels. She's doing actual journalism. The really wild part is how the traditional sports media immediately responded to this bombshell. Instead of doing their jobs, actually investigating whether her claims are legitimate, following up with their own sources, digging deeper into this organizational dysfunction. They went straight on offense. They attacked her character. They questioned her professionalism. They suggested that even speaking about these internal problems was somehow inappropriate and harmful to the league's image. Think about that for a second. Someone provides credible, sourced information about a serious workplace culture issue, and the media's response isn't to investigate the claims. It's to shoot the messenger. That's not journalism. That's not how legitimate news organizations operate. That's pure institutional protection, plain and simple. What Sophie has essentially done is grab that heavily guarded curtain that the Phoenix Mercury, and honestly the entire WNBA establishment, has been hiding behind for years. She's pulled it back just enough for everyone to see what's actually happening when the cameras are turned off and the corporate press releases aren't being carefully crafted. And the establishment absolutely hates that because it exposes something they desperately want to keep hidden. Here's the thing that really matters, though. In a professional sports organization, you can hide a lot of problems from the paying public. You can control the narrative through official statements. You can manage the story through carefully selected interviews. But you cannot hide the fact that your own employees, the people who depend on that organization for their livelihood, cannot stand being around the team. That's not a perception problem you can spin away. That's a fundamental, systemic organizational failure that goes way deeper than just having a rough season or dealing with some personality conflicts. This is the kind of revelation that changes the entire conversation about what's actually happening in Phoenix. And it all started because one person had the courage to tell the truth. Now, while all of this internal chaos was exploding inside the Phoenix Mercury organization, something else happened that perfectly encapsulates exactly how tone-deaf and disconnected this entire system has become from reality. The Arizona Diamondbacks, a Major League Baseball franchise with millions in revenue, a professional marketing department, and highly paid executives whose entire job is to understand public relations, made a decision that was so catastrophically bad that you almost have to wonder if it was intentional. They invited Alyssa Thomas to throw out the ceremonial first pitch at their ballpark during Phoenix Mercury night. Now, if you're not immediately seeing why this is a massive problem, let me spell it out for you. This is the same Alyssa Thomas who, not that long ago, threw a punch directly at Caitlin Clark's throat during a live basketball game. We're talking about an incident that was captured in crystal clear high definition and spread across every sports platform on the internet. It became one of the most discussed moments in WNBA history, and for good reason. The timing here is absolutely critical to understand. At this exact moment in time, Caitlin Clark is the single biggest draw in women's basketball history. She's not just popular, she's a cultural phenomenon. The arrival of this one player has shattered television ratings records that people thought were untouchable. She's sold out entire arenas night after night. She's brought millions of brand new viewers into women's basketball for the very first time. She's transformed the financial landscape of the entire league. And everyone knows about the throat punch incident. It wasn't some obscure moment buried in highlight reels. It was massive news. Sports media covered it constantly. Fans debated it online for weeks. Caitlin Clark's massive legion of new supporters made it absolutely clear that they were not okay with the physical treatment she's receiving on the court. This wasn't some forgotten controversy that had quietly faded away. It was still fresh in everyone's mind when the Diamondbacks made their decision. So here's where it gets really interesting. The Diamondbacks absolutely, unequivocally knew exactly who Alyssa Thomas is in the current sports landscape. They knew about the incident. They understood that Caitlin Clark's fanbase is extremely vocal and fiercely protective of her across every social media platform. They comprehensively grasped that a significant portion of their new baseball audience came specifically because of the WNBA crossover appeal. They had all of this information sitting right in front of them, and they still consciously chose to put Alyssa Thomas on that pitcher's mound in front of thousands of people and millions of viewers online. Now, you could make the argument that it was just a routine Phoenix Mercury night promotion, nothing more than honoring the local WNBA team in their city. That's a fair defensive argument on the surface, right? But here's where that entire argument completely falls apart. The Mercury had other options. Multiple other highly recognizable, respected Mercury players were completely available and ready to participate in that exact same ceremony. The Diamondbacks could have selected literally anyone else on that roster. They could have chosen a player who didn't have this massive controversy attached to her name. They could have made a choice that would have been received positively by the Clark fanbase instead of negatively. But they didn't. They specifically went out of their way to select the one single player whose presence would immediately generate the most intense backlash and the harshest criticism from the broader sports audience. That's not an accident. That's not an oversight. That's a deliberate choice made by people who had all the information they needed to make a smarter decision. And when you, as an organization, consciously make that kind of controversial choice, you absolutely have to own the consequences that follow. You cannot claim ignorance when the entire mainstream sports media has been obsessively covering every angle of the Caitlin Clark situation for months straight. You cannot pretend you didn't know this would be received poorly. That's not how professional decision-making works. The more you actually examine this decision from the Diamondbacks marketing department, the more infuriating it becomes because it reveals a complete and total lack of basic awareness about the current state of professional sports. These are people who are paid substantial salaries specifically to understand public perception, to read the room, to grasp what decisions are going to land well with audiences, and which ones are going to create massive backlash. Let's be completely honest here. The Diamondbacks didn't just make a bad call. They made the absolute worst possible call they could have made. And the crazy part is that it would have been so easy to avoid this entire disaster. There were so many alternative options sitting right there in front of them, completely available and ready to go. Think about the Mercury's roster for a second. You've got experienced, talented players who have been part of this organization for years. You've got players who have strong fan bases of their own. You've got players who, unlike Alyssa Thomas, don't come with massive, fresh controversies attached to their name. One of those players was literally standing right there in the official video of the first pitch ceremony, completely available and ready to step onto that mound. The marketing department could have made one simple phone call and pivoted away from this disaster. But instead, they doubled down on the absolute worst possible choice. And here's what's really telling about this entire situation. It suggests one of two things, and honestly, neither option is good for the Diamondbacks. Either these executives genuinely have no idea how to read the current mainstream sports landscape and understand what modern audiences care about, or they consciously made this choice despite understanding how it would be perceived. If it's the first scenario, that's a massive indictment on the marketing department's competence. These are supposedly professional decision-makers who are paid to understand public relations dynamics. If they genuinely didn't anticipate how badly this would be received, then they're not qualified to be making these kinds of executive choices. They're out of touch with their own audience. They don't understand what their fans care about. If it's the second scenario, then this becomes a deliberate, calculated middle finger to Caitlin Clark's fanbase. And honestly, that might be even worse because it suggests this was done knowingly, with full awareness of the backlash it would create. That's not a mistake. That's an intentional provocation. What makes this situation so incredibly frustrating is that it didn't have to be this way. The Diamondbacks had complete control over this narrative. They had all the information they needed. They could have easily chosen a different Mercury player to represent the team at this event. They could have made a choice that would have been celebrated instead of criticized. They could have shown that they understand and respect this new audience that the WNBA has attracted. Instead, they made a choice that instantly alienated millions of people who were just starting to become invested in baseball. If you're a brand new Caitlin Clark fan who just got interested in the Arizona Diamondbacks because of the WNBA connection, and then you find out they honored the player who physically assaulted your favorite athlete, what do you think your reaction is going to be? You're going to be furious. You're going to feel disrespected. You're going to question whether this organization actually wants your support. And frankly, that's a completely self-inflicted wound. The Diamondbacks shot themselves in the foot with this decision. If thousands of passionate Clark fans decide to boycott future games or stop supporting that franchise, that's entirely on the organization's leadership. They had the power to make a smarter choice, and they consciously chose not to. The visual presentation of that entire moment was just bizarre, too. There's this awkward coyote mascot randomly standing there alongside them on the field. The whole thing looks chaotic, rushed, poorly planned. It feels like they desperately wanted to create some kind of fun viral moment for social media, but they completely failed to consider how it would actually be received by the broader national audience. That lack of foresight is exactly the core problem plaguing the WNBA right now. Here's where this entire situation takes an even stranger turn. Right in the middle of all this chaos, Sophie Cunningham's Bombshell podcast, The Diamondbacks' Disaster, the entire sports world talking about Phoenix Mercury dysfunction, two very important things happened at almost the exact same time. And the timing of these simultaneous events is way too coincidental to ignore. Caitlin Clark unexpectedly missed her scheduled practice with the Indiana Fever. The same day, on the other side of the country, Sophie Cunningham also missed her scheduled practice with the Phoenix Mercury. Both players were officially listed on injury reports with different health issues. But here's what makes this situation incredibly interesting from a news perspective. The timing is just too perfect to be random. According to the official reports, Clark is dealing with a lingering back injury that's keeping her off the floor for practice. That's the story they're putting out there. Meanwhile, Damiris Dantas is apparently getting some very specific individual medical treatment to address her own physical concerns. The Fever have 4 full days of organized practice scheduled during this Commissioner's Cup break before their next game on Sunday. Do the math on that. That's 8 entire days between competitive games for this roster. 8 full, uninterrupted days of crucial rest and recovery time. Now, on the surface, that seems like it should be good news for Caitlin Clark, right? 8 days to rest, recover, and come back stronger. That's a significant amount of time to deal with any lingering physical issues. That's enough time to get proper treatment, to work with medical staff, to make sure everything is ready for the next game. But here's the question that starts to become really problematic if you think about it logically. If Caitlin Clark has truly had 8 full days of complete rest and recovery, and if that back injury is as minor as the team is suggesting, then she should absolutely be ready to play on Sunday, right? That's a massive amount of recovery time. Most back injuries can significantly improve with that level of rest. So if Sunday rolls around and Clark is still not in the lineup, even after 8 days of rest, that's when you have to start asking some incredibly serious questions about her actual status. Because at that point, you can't claim it's just a minor injury that needed a few days rest. If 8 days of complete rest doesn't get her healthy enough to play, then something much more serious is going on. Is the back injury significantly worse than the team is publicly letting on? Are they downplaying the severity because they don't want to create panic about their star player's long-term health? Is Clark perhaps being quietly protected from something else entirely that has nothing to do with a back injury? Or is there something entirely different happening behind the scenes in Indianapolis that absolutely nobody in the mainstream media is talking about yet? The timing here is also worth considering. These absences happened right when Sophie Cunningham was making her bombshell revelations about the Phoenix Mercury organization. Right when the entire sports world was focused on the dysfunction in that locker room. Right when there was massive attention on organizational toxicity and internal conflicts within women's basketball teams. And then suddenly, the biggest star in the league is missing practice due to an injury, while the person who just exposed Phoenix's problems is also conveniently absent. Now, this could all just be coincidence. The back injury could be completely legitimate and unrelated to anything else happening. The timing could just be one of those weird things that happen in sports where multiple situations converge at the same moment. That's certainly possible. But it's also worth noting that the Fever have been incredibly vague about Clark's actual condition. The details are sparse. The team hasn't offered much information about how serious this injury is or what the specific recovery timeline looks like. They're being deliberately cautious with information, which is standard procedure when dealing with star players' health issues. But it also leaves a lot of room for speculation and concern. 8 days is a long time to rest a back injury. If Clark can't play after that kind of recovery time, then people are going to start asking much harder questions about what's really going on. And those are the kinds of questions that organizations desperately want to avoid. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting from a media perspective, because the response from the traditional sports journalism establishment to Sophie Cunningham's honest reporting reveals absolutely everything you need to know about how broken the system actually is. A senior reporter from USA Today, named Megan L. Hall, took it upon herself to publicly slam Sophie for having the audacity to make those critical comments about the Phoenix Mercury organization. And the way that Hall framed her attack is incredibly telling because it shows you exactly how the gatekeepers think. She called Sophie's comments wildly unprofessional. That was her opening salvo. That's how she decided to frame someone providing accurate, sourced, insider information about a legitimate workplace culture problem. Wildly unprofessional, not unverified, not potentially inaccurate, not lacking proper sourcing, just wildly unprofessional. Then Hall went even further and questioned how sharing this insider information supposedly helps with what she called the current discourse around the league. That specific phrasing is absolutely fascinating because it reveals the twisted logic that these gatekeepers are operating under. She's basically arguing that the problem isn't the toxic environment happening inside the Phoenix Mercury organization itself. No, the problem, at least according to her, is simply that Sophie had the audacity to talk about it out loud in a public forum. Think about that for a second. The real problem isn't workplace toxicity. The real problem isn't that employees of a professional organization can't stand being around the team. The real problem, in Hall's view, is that someone spoke up and revealed these issues to the public. That's not journalism. That's institutional protection masquerading as professionalism. Hall then pushed her argument even further, stating outright that there is genuinely not a single valid scenario where any professional player should ever be making these kinds of negative comments about any active sports organization. Not in any scenario. Not ever. Zero exceptions. She's essentially declaring that players should be completely silent about organizational dysfunction. No matter how serious, no matter how credible their sources, no matter how directly they've experienced these problems firsthand. What's absolutely wild about this position is that it's completely at odds with how professional sports journalism actually operates in every other major league. In the NFL, you've got reporters constantly breaking stories about toxic locker rooms, dysfunctional coaching staff, and organizational problems. In the NBA, investigative journalists regularly expose internal conflicts and workplace culture issues. In Major League Baseball, it's the same thing. Sports reporters from major outlets do this type of hard-hitting journalism literally every single day of the week. But somehow, apparently, when someone like Sophie Cunningham does it regarding the WNBA, suddenly it's wildly unprofessional. Suddenly, it's a violation of some unwritten code of conduct. Suddenly, it's inappropriate and harmful to the discourse. There's a massive, glaring double standard happening here, and it's incredibly obvious to anyone actually paying attention. The really infuriating part is that Hall didn't even try to dispute Sophie's actual claims. She didn't go out and investigate whether the information was accurate. She didn't reach out to sources within the Mercury organization to verify or refute what Sophie was saying. She didn't do any actual journalism at all. Instead, her immediate response was to attack Sophie's character and question her professionalism for simply speaking the truth. That's not how legitimate journalism works. If someone makes a claim about an organization, you either investigate whether that claim is true or false, or you acknowledge that you don't have the resources to verify it. You don't just attack the person making the claim and pretend that's a valid journalistic response. That's pure gatekeeping, plain and simple. What Hall's aggressive response really reveals is that the traditional WNBA media establishment is panicking. They're losing control of the narrative. They're realizing that they can't contain the story anymore. And their knee-jerk reaction is to attack the people who are speaking up instead of addressing the actual underlying issues being reported. It's a classic institutional defense mechanism. When you can't defend your institution's actions, you attack the credibility of the person bringing those actions to light. You question their motives. You suggest they're acting unprofessionally. You do absolutely anything except actually address the substance of what they're saying. This is where the entire situation becomes absolutely impossible to defend if you're actually paying attention to how sports journalism actually works in the real world. Because here's the thing that Hall and the rest of the traditional WNBA media establishment don't want you to notice. What Sophie Cunningham did is literally the exact same thing that professional sports journalists do in the NFL, NBA, and MLB every single week. Think about all those stories you read about the toxic locker room culture on an NFL team. Where do you think those come from? They come from reporters who have cultivated sources inside those organizations. Sources who trust them enough to speak confidentially about internal problems. Sources who provide them with direct, first-hand information about workplace dysfunction. That's not unprofessional. That's investigative journalism. That's literally what winning sports reporters do to build their careers. Look at the NBA. You've got beat reporters who regularly break stories about coaching conflicts, front office drama, and player disputes with management. Adrian Wojnarowski and Shams Charania made their entire careers on the ability to get inside sources to talk to them about sensitive organizational matters. That's considered some of the best journalism in professional sports. Those reporters are celebrated for their ability to uncover internal information. In Major League Baseball, the same thing happens constantly. You get stories about dysfunctional front offices, toxic managers, and workplace culture problems regularly. And when those stories come out, people don't attack the reporter for being unprofessional. They praise them for doing hard-hitting investigative work. They recognize that having access to inside sources is valuable, and that using that access responsibly to inform the public is exactly what journalism is supposed to be. But when Sophie Cunningham does the exact same thing for the WNBA, suddenly she's wildly unprofessional. Suddenly, it's inappropriate. Suddenly, it's harmful to the discourse. That's not a difference in journalistic standards. That's a completely transparent double standard, and it exposes something incredibly important about how the WNBA media establishment actually operates. Here's what's really going on underneath all of this. Sophie Cunningham isn't a traditional sports journalist. She's not part of the established media ecosystem. She doesn't have an official press credential or a major news organization backing her up. She built her own platform. She has her own audience. She doesn't depend on the WNBA or any of these organizations for her access or her livelihood. That's incredibly threatening to the traditional gatekeepers, because when reporters have their own platforms and their own audiences, they don't have to filter their reporting through the official media establishment. They don't have to wait for approval from league officials or organization executives. They can go directly to their audience and break stories that the traditional media might suppress or downplay. And that's exactly what scares Hall and people like her. They're losing control. They're realizing that they don't have the power to control the narrative anymore. Players and former players can build platforms. They can speak directly to millions of people. They can bypass the traditional media gatekeepers entirely. And when they do, they can tell stories that contradict the carefully crafted official narrative. So instead of actually investigating Sophie's claims and reporting on whether they're true or false, Hall attacks her. She questions her professionalism. She suggests that even speaking about these issues is inappropriate. That's not journalism. That's institutional protection. That's using the authority of a major media platform to silence voices that are threatening to the power structure. And here's the absolutely critical thing that reveals how broken this system really is. If Megan L. Hall actually believed that players should never speak negatively about their organizations, she would have to oppose this standard in the NFL, NBA, and MLB as well. But she doesn't. Those standards are completely accepted in those leagues. That's considered good journalism in those contexts. The difference is that in those leagues, the traditional media gatekeepers have maintained control of the narrative. They've cultivated their relationships with team executives and league officials. They've positioned themselves as the official arbiters of what information gets reported and what information gets suppressed. But in the WNBA, with the arrival of Caitlin Clark and the massive influx of new mainstream fans, that control is slipping away. New voices are emerging. People like Sophie Cunningham are building their own platforms and reporting their own stories. And the traditional gatekeepers are panicking because they're losing the power they've held for so long. When you actually zoom out and look at the big picture, what's happening with the Phoenix Mercury and the media's response to Sophie Cunningham's reporting is just one symptom of a much, much broader problem that goes to the absolute core of how the WNBA operates as an institution. This isn't just about one dysfunctional team or one reporter's comments. This is about a fundamental mismatch between the way the league has always done business and what the modern sports audience actually expects. For decades, the WNBA has operated inside a very small, very insulated bubble. The fan base was highly loyal, deeply invested, and generally agreeable to the league's preferred narrative about how women's basketball should be discussed and covered. The media ecosystem was small and manageable. The league could control what stories got told and what stories got suppressed. The executive power structure was never really challenged because the audience just wasn't large enough to mount any serious pressure. But then Caitlin Clark arrived and everything changed. Suddenly, millions of new viewers showed up, people who didn't grow up with the WNBA. People who don't have deep emotional investments in protecting the league's legacy institutions. People who have mainstream sports expectations and who aren't afraid to speak up when they see something they don't like. The whole system got thrown off balance almost overnight. The problem is that the league, the organizations, and the traditional media covering the league all still think they can operate the exact same way they always have. They still think they can control the narrative. They still think they can suppress stories they don't like. They still think they can push back against criticism and expect it to just go away. They're using strategies that worked perfectly fine when the audience was small and manageable. But those strategies are completely failing now that millions of mainstream sports fans are paying attention. That's why you see such a defensive, panicked response to Sophie Cunningham's reporting. These institutions are genuinely shocked that someone would have the audacity to speak up about internal organizational dysfunction. They're used to a world where players, former players, and media members just quietly go along with the official narrative. They're used to being able to pressure anyone who steps out of line into silence. But Sophie Cunningham didn't back down. She spoke her truth, and she had the credibility and the platform to make that truth stick. And now the entire establishment is scrambling, trying to figure out how to contain the damage. They're attacking her character instead of addressing her claims. They're questioning her professionalism instead of investigating what she's reporting. They're essentially trying to use intimidation to silence her. What this whole situation reveals is that the WNBA and its associated organizations are completely unprepared for the kind of mainstream scrutiny that Caitlin Clark has brought to women's basketball. These are organizations that have never had to seriously answer hard questions from a massive, skeptical audience. They've never had to take accountability for toxic workplace culture, dangerous on-court behavior, or poor organizational leadership, because nobody with any real platform was asking them to. Now they are, and they don't know how to handle it. The organizations are making desperately poor decisions like inviting Alyssa Thomas to throw out a first pitch while millions of new fans are watching. The media is defending those decisions with increasingly absurd arguments about professionalism and discourse. Meanwhile, the actual problems, the toxic team culture, the physical safety of star players, the broken organizational systems, are just getting worse and worse. What the league needs right now, more than anything else, is accountability. It needs organizations to take a hard look at their internal cultures and ask themselves serious questions about whether they're actually operating in a way that's acceptable for a professional sports environment. It needs media coverage that's willing to hold these organizations accountable instead of protecting them. It needs brave voices like Sophie Cunningham speaking up and telling the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable and unflattering. Because here's the thing that the legacy institutions still don't understand. Millions of new fans showed up for Caitlin Clark and for great women's basketball. But they didn't show up to participate in some carefully controlled, highly sanitized, perfectly manicured version of sports fandom. They showed up with mainstream expectations. They expect accountability. They expect organizations to operate professionally. They expect that the biggest stars in the league are treated fairly and safely on the court. And if the WNBA can't meet those expectations, those fans are just going to leave. They came because they were interested, but they'll go just as easily if they feel like they're being asked to support something broken. So here we are at the absolute critical juncture. The question that everyone in the sports world is asking right now is incredibly simple. What happens next? Does Sophie Cunningham back down, apologize, and retreat? Does she get quietly blackballed from WNBA broadcasting, or does she hold her ground and keep speaking truth? Based on her track record and the unwavering confidence in her voice, my educated guess is that she's absolutely not backing down. She knows what she knows. She has the sources. She's not afraid of the blowback coming her way. And honestly, that's exactly what the WNBA needs right now. Not gatekeeping, not institutional protection, not sanitized narratives, just honest, brave journalism that's willing to call out toxic cultures and hold powerful organizations accountable. The real question is whether the WNBA will learn from this moment or double down on defending the broken system. That answer will determine everything about the league's future with its new mainstream audience.